All right. Hey guys, welcome to the lesson. So in this lesson, I want to give you guys a brief overview of one of the most powerful tools when it comes to processing information at a deep level. It's called knowledge maps, and I would say that it's the most, if not one of the most powerful tools, and definitely my go-to when it comes to, having information and reorganizing it and processing at the level of an expert, right? So we're going to go through a few different types of knowledge maps that I use. This isn't an exhaustive list, but these are some of the more common ones that I use, and I'll walk you through the different conditions for when to use them and how they compare. In the next lessons, we'll dive deeper into each of them, compare and contrast what good versus bad is in different scenarios, and how to do your own knowledge maps and optimize them. All right. So there are three different types we're going to look at. We're going to look at flow maps, concept maps, and mind maps. Now, before I do that, I do want to explain a little bit about why my knowledge maps are so useful. All right. So let's actually quickly get there. All right. So the when and why we use knowledge maps. So again, as I said, it's really useful whenever you want to process information at a deep level. All right. And some of the reasons why it works so well is, well, one, enhances creativity. When you have a bunch of ideas and connections put on a page, what happens is that those ideas and connections, because they're probably related to some kind of prior knowledge structures you have, they start to light up in all these new like other ideas and connections in your head. Besides enhancing creativity, there are a few other reasons why it's so effective. So improving metacognition. We looked at metacognition as this idea of reflecting on your own thinking process. And the reason why mind maps are so useful is because by having your thinking process out on paper, you can use your cognitive resources where instead of holding on to information trying to manipulate it, although that's a necessary part of learning, which we'll look at a little bit more, you're able to use those resources to think about how you're going to restructure things, what changes you're going to make to your thought process. And by making changes on paper, you make changes pretty much directly in your head, right? Now, this again connects to the kind of this last point where knowledge maps really closely resemble how our mind stores information. And when you think about just regular text or notes, oftentimes it's like words, etc. But that's not really how our mind represents information. And so the cool thing about it is that your thought process is laid out, and because it's laid out, it allows you to use your cognitive resources to fix it. And so, given the fact that knowledge maps resemble how our mind stores information, you're literally fixing your thought process on demand. While as if it was fixing your notes, it wouldn't have that kind of like direct effect, if that makes sense. Again, the other reason it offloads information. So this is just a general thing about notes, like having information, holding information in your head. By putting it onto your notes, you offload that, and so you no longer have to think about it. That saves you some resources that you can use for other things like metacognition, etc. Improves understanding. So knowledge maps are really the go-to when it comes to generating connections. And if we can think about understanding as generating connections between ideas, then certainly does that. All right. So these are some of the reasons why it's so effective, at least the main ones. All right. So now let's actually get back to the different knowledge maps that we had. All right. So we had flow maps, concept maps, and mind maps. So I want to give a brief idea of when I would use each of these, how they're different, and how they actually blend, because I try to make the distinction as best as I could, but at the same time, it's not fully clear. So when I describe each of them, there are going to be some similarities in, but concept maps are kind of like mind maps, and concept maps are also kind of like flow maps. So that's something, all right? Now, flow maps are really good for when it comes to understanding processes. So if you've ever learned some stuff about business, you'll know that oftentimes they have these things called funnels, and it's where you have a start and an endpoint and then a process in between. And so there are different steps in between the process and like transitions between them. And that's where flow map really shines and is going to help you understand that whole process, right? Concept maps, I find them more useful when it comes to answering specific questions. So you have a specific question, and then the answer you can organize in a way where it's concepts and different ideas connected to it. All right. Mind maps are better when it comes to general ideas. So it's really about what are the big ideas, what are their connections, what are the sub ideas, and how do they connect. Now, if I had to rank in order of difficulty, I would say that flow maps are the easiest to master, concept maps second hardest, and mind maps are certainly the hardest. There's a lot more nuances when it comes to it. And each of them are used in different phases of learning. So that's kind of like a brief overview. On the other hand, they do have some similarities. Like you can think of mind maps almost like focus maps. I'm sorry, almost like concept maps, because at the end of the day, you could ask the focus question of, well, what are the big ideas? How do they connect? What are the sub ideas? How do they connect? So it's almost like a subset of the concept map, but again, the flow map, you can also view it as a subset of the concept map because you're trying to understand, well, what's the process here. But really the best way I find to distinguish them is just kind of the purpose. So one of them is for process, one of them is for just answering general questions, not general, well, answering questions. So it's like more specific. Concept maps are more specific than mind maps, and mind maps are just for getting the big picture overview of everything and how they connect and all that stuff. So they have those different conditions, and I find that's the best way to distinguish them based off of the conditions, not just kind of their characteristics, if that makes sense. So in the next lessons, we'll walk through each of these in more depth, examples, comparisons, all that. All right, so stay tuned for it, and I'll see you there. All right.